Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Moon Hye-ryeon filling in for Kim Mok-yeon. Over the weekend, President Lee Jae Myung wrapped up a 5-day overseas trip that took him from Türkiye, where he attended his first NATO summit since taking office, to Mongolia, where he capped off the tour with a state visit. Deepening Korea's ties with the world's largest defense market and expanding trade relations with Mongolia were both high on the agenda. To break it all down, we connect with Youngshik Bong, visiting professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Right, and also joining us is Andrew Millard, Head of International Relations at Changwon National University. Very good to see you, Professor.
Good evening. Thanks for having me again.
So, Professor Bong, let's start with the NATO summit first. Ahead of the summit, the Blue House revealed that President Lee Jae Myung was setting out to focus on defense industry sales diplomacy. Now, how would you assess this NATO summit in terms of this goal?
As a member of the IP4, Indo-Pacific 4 members, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, head of state of South Korea has been invited to the NATO summit meeting in recent years. And this is the second year of presidency of Lee Jae Myung. And in his first year, he attended the G7 summit meeting in Canada. And he hoped to have a meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump in the scheduled NATO summit meeting. But because of the beginning of the air bombings by the U.S. Air Forces on the nuclear facility in Iran at that time, he decided to stay in South Korea to monitor the economic situations. So there was a kind of missed opportunity for President Lee Jae Myung to announced to the entire world that democratic Korea is indeed back. But this time, being able to connect both his trip to European Union and his attendance to the G7 summit meeting in France and NATO summit meeting this time in Türkiye, he was able to combine his diplomatic agendas and the agenda of economic cooperation, but at the same time, South Korea's contribution to international security, as well as making deals with major partners in European Union, which happens to be the biggest, defense industrial market, potential export opportunities of the military industrial products of South Korea.
Right, so the attendance itself was obviously very significant, but building on this summit, as Professor Bong just mentioned, negotiations for a framework agreement on procurement between Korea and NATO have officially begun, and now this aims to enter NATO's joint procurement market, which could be worth up to roughly 15 trillion won annually. Now, Professor Millard, what do you think is the significance of launching this agreement, and what new opportunities might it bring for Korean defense companies going forward?
So this is hugely significant for South Korea's defense industry. I think the first thing we should start by saying is they've started negotiations. At the moment, there's no deal actually in place. So I think that's important that we just make sure that everyone's clear on that point. But as they go through these negotiations and they work towards a deal, we're going to see basically South Korea all at once getting access effectively now to 32 countries all working together. Up until now, even though South Korea is a member of the IP4 and does work closely with NATO, effectively the defense industry has been working more on sort of bilateral agreements. So we've seen over the past few years, started with Turkey quite a few years ago, but more recently with Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, those countries, there's been bilateral agreements. Once we get this procurement agreement in place, basically now South Korea is part of NATO, working together on various different programs, different projects. So effectively, this is Korea all together working at what, basically promoting itself, selling its products, selling its capabilities to 32 major powers all at once. So this is really the biggest benefit, the most significant. But of course, it's also much more binding. Once they're part of this program, it's no longer just about President Lee going to Europe, meeting with leaders, saying, oh, this is what South Korea has to offer, you should work with us. Once they're part of this system, then they're going to be working much closer. There's going to be more technological transfer and various issues, more contracts and so on. So it's more binding, and effectively it moves South Korea away from being effectively more of an observer now to being much more of a participant. We could argue much more of a full member, really, of NATO. So this is also very important. And like we said, once we get this sort of membership, once we start working and collaborating, selling obviously also South Korean products, but joint procurement, joint cooperation, then also we get more technological transfer, which we can then bring back to South Korea as well, boosting further the South Korean defense industry. But of course, there's also benefits for NATO. NATO is also looking to diversify its supply chains. We know that South Korea, over the past sort of 4 or 5 years, has really been the second biggest exporter into Europe, not directly to Ukraine, but to other countries. And so this is very significant. We're going to see benefits for South Korea, but also benefits for NATO as well.
Right, so it sounds like there's a lot of potential here. But, to get into more specifics about what kind of benefits there could be, Germany was recently selected for Canada's, submarine program, and Korea failed ultimately to win the contract. And analysts have been pointing to long-standing cooperation among NATO member states and Europe's defense network as contributing factors. And Professor Bong, do you think that strengthening ties with NATO could potentially become an opportunity to boost Korea's competitiveness in the European defense market and in future major contract bids?
Yes, it will. That is why it is a big task for any, future presidents of South Korea. It's kind of important homework to do if South Korea wants to elevate itself as a major defense industry exporters in the world. This time, why the Canada decided to choose German industry over Hana Ocean, South Korean submarine company, are two reasons. One is interoperability as a NATO member country. Canada is, and since the TKMS, the German company, accounts for the supply of the submarines for the NATO, at least 1/3 of all the supplies of submarines. So there's a reason for Canada to choose the continued and reliable supply of the submarines instead of choosing South Korea as a new partner. And second thing is a strategic trust. South Korea is not a member of the NATO. So sharing the same strategic vision and urgency, very important litmus test for Canada as importer of very important armaments for its own national security and the important elements of its contributions to the collective self-defense, the mandatory of the NATO as a collective security organization. So the good news is that all of the world, including Canada, clearly recognize the technological superiority of South Korean military industries. The bad news is that as a member outside of the collective security system of NATO, South Korea has a long way to go to overcome the existing hurdles. The important development in the context of the strained strategic partnership between the United States under the Trump administration and the European member countries of the NATO is that the European NATO members has tried to diversify supply chains of the essential military equipment and armament, as Professor Millard clearly mentioned. But that movement has not really led to choosing South Korea as a replacement of the United States as a reliable supplier of the military equipment, but rather self-defense, self-made effort among the European members of the NATO countries under the slogan of the Rearm Europe plan for the next 5 years in the scale of at least 800 billion euros. So the attempts of the European countries to move away from their reliance upon the United States has not been materialized for their choice for South Korea as an alternative to the United States. So South Korea needs to be very strategic in order to take advantage of this strategic shift made by the European countries.
Right, well, this certainly seems to be worth, the institutional groundwork. But moving on from just, supplying the arms, President Lee also proposed a new defense industry partnership between Korea and NATO that goes beyond just simple arms deals to encompass joint research, production, and operations. Now, as a member of NATO's Indo-Pacific partner countries, what kind of leading role can Korea be expected to play going forward in global security and the defense industry?
So I think, firstly, you're right that up until now, Korea has really been seen as a supplier. And I think the Ukraine war really brought that home. South Korea, it's very good at producing very quickly. In terms of cost, it's pretty price competitive, and it's good quality. Is it the same level of technological capability as the other countries? This is where South Korea, up until now, has maybe been a little bit weaker than especially America. For example, if you look at fighter jets, you have the Chinese, the Americans, they're already developing the 6th generation. Whereas South Korea has just released a new one. It's only a 4.5 generation. So it is a little bit behind. And so up until now, it's really had that supplier sort of tag, that label. However, I do think, and Professor Bong, I think a couple of points he mentioned very important there. In terms of trust, South Korea, it's taken a long time. It's taken 20, 30 years, but it's really built very good trust with the Europeans. And so I think this is why we're now starting to see more and more cooperation, South Korea being brought into NATO much more. Just also to add to what Professor Bong said about the European spending, I think this is also very important to mention. So we have ReArm Europe, we have SAFE. Now, the SAFE is basically only for EU member states. So South Korea is not eligible for a lot of that funding, but that's 150 billion euros. There's another 650 billion euros worth of defense spending, which actually South Korea, through ReArm Europe and Readiness 2030, is eligible to accept. And so I think we should also add that when it comes to the failure to get the submarine contract, why it went to Germany was again another part of, and Professor Bong sort of implied this also, the Europeans right now, through a lot of EU funding as well, are being incentivized to buy European. So I think even in the future, once South Korea does start in terms of joint procurement, joint production and so on, I think it is going to take quite a while for South Korea really to boost its exports as well in other areas. I just wanted to add that as well. When it comes to the Indo-Pacific, however, this is really where South Korea can play a bigger role, especially compared to Japan, Australia, New Zealand. If we look at the NATO summit just happened in Ankara, who was there? President Lee was there. However, for Japan, Australia, New Zealand, it was only the defense ministers. The leaders were not there. So this shows that South Korea is much more interested. It's prioritizing these relations much more. And the Europeans, the NATO leaders, they will recognize this. They will see South Korea is on the ball. It's prioritizing these agreements. And therefore, later on, when the Europeans, when they're looking for more trusted partners in Asia, in the IP4, they're firstly going to come to South Korea rather than the others. So I think altogether this idea, and Professor Bong mentioned trust, is very, very important. And I think for Asia, South Korea is doing a much more aggressive role and quite an important one.
Right, so both of you have flagged trust as, key words throughout this conversation. And, to expand on this and, Korea's relations with European countries, Korea pledged $100 million in support for Ukraine while maintaining its position of not providing any lethal weapons. Now, Professor Bong, how would you assess this diplomatic approach, considering Korea's relations with both NATO allies and Russia?
It is essential for South Korea as a sovereign country to maintain productive and friendly relationships with both European countries, Ukraine and Russia. And South Korea's position has been persistent, meaning that South Korea has been really aggressive in providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. But South Korea has stopped at providing weapons of mass destruction to Ukraine because it will be in violation of bilateral agreement signed between the former Soviet Union and today's Russia and South Korea. So what's going to happen after South Korea pledged to provide massive amount of financial assistance to Ukraine? Will it endanger inter-Korean relations with North Korea and South Korea's relations with Russia? The concern has been raised by some observers. But I don't think there's much to worry about because first, the strategic partnership between North Korea and Russia has been already peaked. So there's not much additional capability of Russia and North Korea to express their oppositions or even retaliations to South Korea's decision to assist Ukraine. And second, Russia needs to maintain a good partnership with South Korea, remembering South Korea's potential to be a very important economic partners for Russia once the war between Ukraine and Russia will be over. When you compare the bilateral economic ties and bilateral trade between Russia and North Korea and those between Russia and South Korea, Russia's future choice will be naturally South Korea. So there's a reason for Russia to be reasonable. And third and final point for Russia's expected restraint is that South Korea has not crossed the red line set by Russia, which is supply of offensive weapons from South Korea to Ukraine, as I mentioned. And Russia has not crossed the red line set by South Korea, which is Russia providing essential technological and material assistance to North Korea for North Korea's further development of intercontinental ballistic missiles or more sophisticated nuclear power submarines and nuclear bombs. So both sides have been quite restrained in terms of coping with each other's responses to the war in Ukraine. I think the pragmatic reason will continue to prevail between Russia and South Korea, even after South Korea's decision to provide financial assistance to Ukraine.
All right, so it looks like Korea is navigating competing pressures from different directions on this issue. Now, moving away from Europe slightly, Professor Millard, at NATO summit's official dinner, President Lee Jae Myung met with U.S. President Trump to follow up on discussions regarding the construction of U.S. military vessels, and the two agreed to pursue a future visit to Washington and additional summit meetings. Now, what significance does this meeting hold for Korea-U.S. defense cooperation and bilateral relations?
So firstly, we should say it's very good that Donald Trump now has good relations with President Lee. Generally, Donald Trump has not spoken so positively about South Korea as a whole. So the fact that in the G7, they started good relations and talked about golf, and this has continued on now. This shows there's a very strong personal relationship developing, and Donald Trump golf diplomacy, very important for him. But more important than that, we now have these working level meetings taking place much more often, and it's at the working level that things really get done. This is where we see the tangible results. So this could be development cooperation, more contracts, technological transfers happening, joint cooperation, joint ventures, and so on in the future. So we're seeing more and more of this happening. So there's deeper and deeper, again, more trust between the US and South Korea. But generally, on the whole, I think in terms of defense, generally relations are pretty good. The fact that it's now overspilling into submarines and the maritime industry, this is very important. And I think Donald Trump, the US administration, also starting to recognize the value of having South Korea on their side, having good relationships for a strengthening US shipbuilding industry, because South Korea, even though it's only the second biggest producer, actually South Korea produces technologically very, very complex ships compared to China and even compared to Japan. So South Korea really has the big advantage here, and it's in the favor of the US for defense as well to have good relationships in this area.
I'd like to jump in to express my concern. Although in general, I agree with Professor Millard about the solid nature of current bilateral partnership between the two countries as security allies. In terms of moving forward to realize what is agreed in the fact sheet as a result of the summit meeting between US President Donald Trump and South Korean Lee Jae Myung last year, many issues are tangled, especially the concern for US corporations being discriminated in the South Korea's domestic market in the aftermath of the scandal with the company Coupang and the US accusation of South Korean government. And the recent development inside the US Congress, especially the adoption of a report by the National Security Committee of the US Senate, which ties transfer of wartime operational control from the United States to South Korea and the construction of nuclear power submarines jointly by the United States and South Korea. Then when these issues will not be smoothly settled at the level of top leaderships, then fulfillment of the major agreements, especially the wartime operational control transfer and the construction of South Korea's own nuclear power submarines, can be rejected or even significantly postponed. Then there will be a big blow to the future of the security cooperation between two allies under the current leadership. So if these two leaders are going to meet person to person, either in Washington or in Seoul in near future, then the economic issues should be settled in order to these two allies to move forward with the security issues.
Right, so some very interesting discussions between both our professors here tonight, but that's where we'll have to leave our discussion tonight. Professor Bong and Professor Millard, thank you very much for joining me this evening and sharing your insights as always.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Hope to speak to you again very soon. So that will be all from us from Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.